Good evening, class.
Good evening.
Yes, so today we are going to learn about seams and maybe someone to remind us on what we learned on our last lesson.
Yes, I remember control of fullness, where we looked at ways like use of gathers, tags, splits, smoking, and sharing.
Yes, very good. So today we are going to learn about seams. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to define the term seam, understand the factors to consider when selecting seams, and also know different types of seams. So someone please to help us define the term seam. Anyone to give it a try?
Yes, a seam is a line where two or more pieces of fabric are joined together by stitching.
Yes, very good. So what I have, a seam is a term that refers to the stitching line where two fabrics are stitched together. The stitching line along the seam is called a seam line, forming a seam allowance. So the definition of seam allowance is the space between the fabric edge and the seam line. So now we go to the factors to consider when selecting seams. Anyone with an idea? Anyone, please? Alice, can you give it a try? Angela, can you try? Okay, then factors to consider when choosing seams. Factor number one, we consider the type of fabric. Where you ask yourself, what kind of a fabric is it? And this will be your top consideration. A loosely woven cotton seam will be finished differently from a rayon blended fabric seam. A lace cloth will have a different seam than a denim cloth. Next, we consider the seam placement, where a curved seam will be differently treated from a straight seam. If it is an exposed seam as in a pant, it will be different from the enclosed seam as in a yoke or a collar. The next consideration is a sewing machine. You consider what type of a machine you have. The attachments of a machine are also important. If you have a Singer or at least a zigzag machine, you have more possibilities than a single straight stitch machine. The next consideration is garment purpose and use. A child's dress will need a more sturdy seam than a camisole top. A wedding gown will not have the same finishing seam as in a biker gear. Then now we look at the types of seams. Anyone with an idea of the types of seams?
Plain seam,
Yes, very good. Someone else to
A
try?
French seam, French
Yes,
seam,
yes, good.
a double stitched seam also.
Yes, thank you. So what I have, we have plain seam as mentioned, lapped seam. You also mentioned French seam and double seam. And we also have corded or piped seam, and we have hemmed fell seam. So we start by defining a plain seam and knowing the procedure of making it. So in a plain seam, two fabrics are joined together along the seam by a line of stitching. It is also called a single needle butterfly stitch. As once the seam is made, the seam allowance are pressed open to either sides of the seam to look like a butter. Here is an example of a plain made seam. So you stitch straight, joining two fabrics together. This is the simplest and easiest seam to make. It can be made by hand or by a machine. Straight stitches are used to make this seam, though sometimes a tight zigzag stitch can also be used to make this seam. The seam requires a seam finish, for it exposes edges. The advantage of a plain seam is that this seam does not add bulk to the seam line, but also as it has only single line of stitch, the strength of the stitch is not that great. We got the procedure of making a plain seam. Point number 1, you keep the two fabrics together with the right sides together. Make sure the stitching lines are aligned, then you pin in place. The next point, you stitch along the line you have made, making the seam line. Then the third, you start stitching and then do a back stitch for strength. At the end also, do a back stitch and then a forward stitch. The last procedure, do not forget the pressing to press the seam open using an iron box. That's the end of our lesson, and in our next lesson, we begin by knowing the procedure of making a lapped seam. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Welcome.